Indeed, Bongani, so no new nuclear energy. We stick with what we have. That's according to the IRP, government's energy plan until 2030. To discuss the new blueprint, we're joined by energy commentator from EE Publishers, Chris Yelland. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
I'm sure you are delighted about the lack of nuclear.
Well, I'm not against nuclear technology per se. What I am concerned about is the business case for new nuclear when there are other options that are much cheaper and that are more flexible and can be built quicker in smaller chunk sizes, which means they can adapt easier to changes in demand for electricity. And there have been very significant changes in the projected demand for electricity since the 2010 IRP.
Well, before we get to that, I mean, the fact is this was delayed, this new plan. The former president was lobbying for nuclear. The fact that that is off the table, if that was about state capture, as claimed, does that mean we're free now?
Well, the new IRP looks, at the moment, only until 2030. And new nuclear is off the table until at least 2030, and the minister announced that there will be some detailed studies in the interim. I must say there have been detailed studies going on for the last 10 to 15 years on nuclear, so I'm not sure how much more one can study and come up with conclusions, but the bottom line is the alternative technologies, that is solar PV and wind and energy storage and gas, are coming down in price. And nuclear is, if anything, going up in price largely because of the rate of exchange of South Africa. So as time goes by, and certainly if they relook at it in 2030, the chances are that the business case for nuclear could be even worse than it is today.
And then we'll see how renewables are working. So 46% coal, so coal is still there, but we're not expanding coal. 16% gas, 15% wind. How different is that to the current mix?
Well, it's very different. At the moment, we have a very large percentage of coal in the mix. So we're heavily dependent on primary energy from coal. And we're also heavily dependent on Eskom as the major generator of electricity. So what we're seeing now in terms of the new capacity build announced in the IRP 2018 today, or the draft today, is no new Eskom coal beyond Medupi and Kusile. These are existing projects that are committed. There's a small amount of new coal, but these are going to be from IPPs, not Eskom. So can you see there's a diversification of generators, and there's also a diversification of primary energy, because in the mix that has been announced today, the new capacity is effectively going to come from wind and solar PV and gas and hydro, imported hydro, which is also renewable energy, and only a small amount, 1,000 megawatt, from new coal, and that new coal is coming from IPPs and not Eskom.
And this is what you wanted, a dispersed grid with different people feeding in, so you're not reliant on one body, like you say, and then things go wrong at Eskom and the whole country is affected. Is this a whole new world for these independent power producers that have been begging for opportunities for a very long time?
Well, it's a growing new world, and I think there's more to come. But one of the stumbling blocks is to create what is known as an independent system and market operator, a transmission grid operator that allows equal access on level playing fields to all generators based on economic grounds and not on vested interests as they are at the moment, where Eskom is not only the owner of the grid, but it's also the owner of generators, so it gives preference to its own generation capacity rather than IPP. So I think the next step that should come is this restructuring of the electricity supply industry, where we have an independent system and market operator, independent grid, which really will allow independent power producers to flourish based on economic grounds and not on political or vested interest grounds.
And then theoretically anybody can produce power?
Well, not just anybody in theory, but of course one has to have the capital resources, the technical resources. In order to do this, one has to make significant commitments to socio-economic upliftment in South Africa. So there's a lot of strings attached. But in principle, it opens the door not just to Eskom going into renewable energy or coal or nuclear, but other parties as well.
will this happen? I mean, it sounds like we are now committed to renewable energy. I love that. But have we met our previous targets? How important is the IRP as a policy document?
Well, one of the biggest differences in the assumptions of the current IRP 2018 compared to the 2010 is that there's been a downward forecast of electricity demand compared to the forecast in 2010. And really there are some fundamental changes taking place. And it's not just driven by the availability of electricity, it's driven by what is known as the energy intensity in South Africa. That means the amount of energy needed per unit of gross domestic product. And so there's a change taking place as we move away from these heavy smokestack industries, the smelting industries, which use a lot of energy, into more manufacturing and services-based industries. So the decline in demand has really lowered South Africa's requirements for new capacity, and that new capacity that there is being looked at as clean energy and flexible energy in small chunk sizes to meet these changing and uncertain future demand for electricity.
Well, let's talk about that, because the demand apparently at the same level seen in 2007, so we're almost going back 10 years. You're talking about a difference. Some are saying this just enforces everything. Our economy is stagnant. People are not growing their businesses because you need power to do that. What is it?
Yeah, people are also becoming more efficient as the price of electricity has rocketed in the last decade. So people are using electricity much more carefully, sparingly, efficiently, and that's another driver towards this. And of course, when we talk about the amount of electricity now being at the levels of 2007, one's talking about grid electricity. There's also a growing off-grid electricity, alternatives to grid electricity, and people who are supplementing their grid electricity supply. They're keeping a grid electricity connection, but they are supplementing it with what is known as behind-the-meter solar PV systems, which enable them to reduce their demand from the grid. So whilst grid electricity has not grown, in fact, per capita, grid electricity has declined in the last decade because population has increased, but the amount of kilowatt hours has basically stayed the same. So the amount of kilowatt hours per capita has dropped, and this is a result of numerous factors, including energy efficiency, high prices, off-grid, supplementing grid suppliers, the general economy, the poor growth in the economy.
All right, and not good news for Eskom given its financial situation, but at least we are becoming more efficient and committing to renewable energy. Thank you very much, Chris Yelland from EE Publishers. Bongani?